3 weeks ago on this show, Rod Dreher told us the disturbing story of the time he tried to help Tucker Carlson after Tucker's demonic encounter. Tucker says that on the night of February 20th, 2023, he woke up unable to breathe. He walked around his house and came back to find 4 bleeding claw marks on either side of his rib cage. His wife and 4 dogs slept through it. He reached out to his friend Rod Dreher, and Rod connected him with 2 exorcists who were willing to help. But Tucker refused. He told Rod, quote, "I'm too Protestant for that," and that exorcism felt like witchcraft. So Rod offered to help him find a Protestant deliverance minister. And again, Tucker refused. After that, Rod told us on the show, Tucker started going dark. I didn't laugh when Tucker told the world about his demonic encounter, and I certainly didn't laugh when I learned from Rod that he had refused spiritual guidance afterward. When someone says they were attacked by demons and then goes on to become one of the leading Jew-hating voices in the country, I tend to believe them. The conversation about the spiritual realm is happening at every level of American life right now. Vice President JD Vance said publicly in March that he doesn't believe UFOs are extraterrestrials. He believes they're demons. Another podcaster, Sean Ryan, told Tucker just last month he recently took psychedelic drugs and experienced hell firsthand. Pew Research, published late last year, said that 30% of Americans consult astrology, tarot, or a fortune teller at least once a year. 27% of American Christians claim that they do it too. Springtide research found that more than half of teenagers and young adults practice tarot or fortune telling. The psychic services industry did an estimated $2.3 billion of business in 2024. The age of scientific materialism is over. The hunger for the spiritual is real. The guardrails haven't caught up to the moment. True crime Gnosticism could be its own religion among the Wine 30 crowd. Women are showing solidarity with a confessed child murderer in Lindsay Clancy, and many are offering accusations of murder against her husband based on nothing but astrology charts and secret knowledge. Candace Owens is leading what I would characterize as a demonically driven attack on a grieving widow with false accusations against her and many of her late husband's closest friends. Satan himself is known in Scripture as the accuser. He hates Jews and widows too. Candace has publicly claimed that Charlie Kirk is appearing to her in dreams and that she and Charlie both used to practice astral projection. That she's doing all of this while claiming to be a champion of the Catholic Church makes the whole affair that much more spiritually damaging. A plausible case can be made that Candace Owens almost single-handedly derailed the biggest Christian revival of the 21st century so far, just after Charlie Kirk's assassination. It's hard to imagine a greater act of spiritual evil. Last week, in response to a viewer comment on her podcast, Candace proclaimed, "We are Legion." Verbal Kent told us that the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world he didn't exist. Turns out the devil has more than one trick. When the conversation about the supernatural opens up without the structures that make it navigable, without sound theology, without accountability, it leads to bad places fast. What begins as spiritual hunger often ends in darkness and confusion. What begins as curiosity ends in paranoia and conspiracy. And in the digital age, all of this is spreading online to millions of people on a daily basis. Our culture is in desperate need of clarity and guidance on this issue. And tonight, I have 3 guests who offer just that. Dr. Richard Gallagher is a board-certified psychiatrist, a practicing Catholic, and the longest-standing American member of the International Association of Exorcists, and the only layman and only psychiatrist ever to serve on its governing council. He's personally evaluated more cases of suspected demonic possession than any other physician in the world. Jenn Nizza spent years as a professional psychic medium. She cried out to Jesus in her mid-30s and has spent every day since warning people about the dangers of spiritualism and the occult. She's the author of the upcoming book, Darkness in Disguise. And returning to the show, our friend Billy Hallowell, who spent 2 decades as a skeptical investigative journalist covering faith and the supernatural. His CBN film, Investigating the Supernatural, Angels and Demons, explores the reality of the spiritual realm through interviews with astrophysicists, theologians, psychiatrists, alongside personal accounts of miraculous survivals and demonic encounters. Thank you guys for being on the show.
Thank you
for having
Billy,
us.
how did we come to be in this place as a country?
Well, that's a big question. I think it goes back decades. We've sort of skirted belief. We've walked away from belief as a culture. We've said we don't need God. We've told young people, you can kind of do whatever you want. Whatever feels good, do it. And we've sort of created this, secular religion that doesn't stand up. And so that sort of brought us to a breaking point where a lot of young people are realizing, well, wait a minute, that was all a lie. That doesn't make any sense. We can't find fulfillment in that. And so you have this really interesting moment where you have the revival breaking out that we see, while also a lot of young women, I mean, you described some of this in your monologue, a lot of young women engaging in the occult, engaging in crystals, teenagers, right? People are looking for power. It's not that they don't believe there's power. It's that they now are open to it, but they don't know what source to go to. And so that's a very quick overview, but I think the media, Hollywood, education really primed it. COVID broke it. And I think now what we're watching, these big events have sort of opened us up to a little bit of this chaos right now.
So do the numbers support it? I mean, if you look back 30 years ago, everybody goes through a phase. Somebody brings a Ouija board to a birthday party, or you go get someone read some tarot cards. Some girl that you go to class with has a tarot card that's missing the Joker. I don't know, right? But these are just sort of normal things that people engage with, probably more for fun than for any actual sort of spiritual, encounter. Is it? So I guess my questions are: is every instance of engagement with these sorts of practices sort of equally loaded from a spiritual point of view? And is it actually increasing the way that we all seem to feel that it is? I mean, it's certainly much more public than it used to be, but are the actual numbers higher than they used to be of people doing this?
It's interesting. There's not a lot of data on it. And this is something that's been frustrating. Like, there's not a lot of tracking data on it. So it's hard to say. There's nothing new under the sun. The Bible tells us that, right?
Yeah.
But I think there's an intensity that is new, meaning that there's more people curious about it because of social media. You have witch talk on TikTok. You have all these trends. So before, when people were doing it, it was kind of like a quote unquote rite of passage for a lot of people to play the Ouija board, right?
Yeah.
But now you have digital versions of it. Now you have films about it. So there's this infusion of it. You walk into a bookstore, it's the first thing you see. I live in New York. You see witchcraft books the minute you walk in, before you're even in the store. That's newer.
Yeah.
So there's nothing new under the sun, but I think the intensity is new, and the thirst for something bigger. Again, nothing new under the sun, but I think that has intensified in this moment in our lifetime.
Well, that is an interesting phenomenon that we're experiencing sort of across the culture. I've been talking a lot lately about what I call destination vices. That when I was growing up, if you wanted to gamble, you went to Las Vegas. And so some people could be addicted to gambling, but really not many, because it just wasn't ubiquitous enough. It wasn't available enough for the average person to be immoderate. Pornography. There's always been pornography for as long as there's been men drawing on cave walls. But for when we were growing up, maybe your uncle had some magazine that you would see when you'd sneak a peek at, or you actually had to go stand at a counter and look across at the guy at the convenience store and buy a physical magazine. Now all those vices are ubiquitous. They're on your phone. They're in your pocket.
They're traveling with you.
They're traveling with you, and so people's use of them. It's probably not that more people look at pornography today than looked at pornography 20 years ago, but more people look at pornography all the time than have ever looked at pornography in all of human history. I mean, the availability of it is the thing that's fundamentally changed.
And the normalization of it. It becomes
and the normalization of it.
And same with this.
Is that true here, that because social media, there's always been a horoscope in the back of the newspaper, but now you can go so deep into these things so quickly. You can build community around them in ways that you just never could before. Jenn, you worked in this field for almost 2.5 decades.
Yeah.
What percentage of people did you encounter who were really looking for something versus people who thought it was funny or thought that it was fun, who came to you sort of for entertainment?
Really, I would say almost 100% of the people that came to me were really seeking.
Really?
It was not for entertainment. Now, we're about to come upon the Halloween season, and the Halloween season was when I would get hired for parties. Because but the people that sat before me for the readings, that signed up to, for the readings and came to the party, they actually really were seeking knowledge. They were seeking hidden knowledge, and they wanted that supernatural experience. The Halloween essence gives it that creepy allure, that idea that we can talk to the dead, and it can be entertaining, but these people really wanted to have an encounter with a deceased person.
Did you feel, I know you've talked about this before, but for people who haven't encountered your work, did you feel that you could really provide them with that at the time?
Oh yeah, 100%. And I really believed I was helping people too.
Yeah.
Because I really was receiving information that I could never have known. I was receiving information about these people. We would sit in front of each other just like this, and I would start channeling. and I would get information about the people that they love that have, departed, that are deceased, and then giving me information about their life, things that have happened in the past, birthdays, real accurate information that these people could validate. And it gives the idea that then it must be so, because I don't know you from a hole in the wall. How do you know how my mom died? How did you know what her dad did for a living? How did you know where I was last week, where I was eating dinner, and that secretive little thing that happened that nobody even knew about, but you're able to tell me that. You're able to relay that information. It gives the experience the credibility that you are really speaking to the dead.
So this wasn't a carnival trick for you. This was, you were channeling actual. How did you come out of that?
Well, Jesus pulled me out of it. Praise the Lord. It was a process. It wasn't an instantaneous deliverance. At the end of my 36th year, I was so demonically oppressed. It was horrible. It was like a suffocation. I had so many demons around me, a multitude of them, and I cried out on the name of Jesus. And it was God who did that. God moved me to cry out on the name of Jesus, because I would never have chosen to do that. I would have called upon my spirit guide or a deceased loved one, my grandmother or something like that. So I know that that was God in that moment, nudging me to call on the name of the Lord. And I did do that. And I did encounter this amazing peace that came over me, but I didn't know the gospel. I didn't know that I was a sinner in need of a savior, and that we have one. And he went to the cross to die for my sins, and that he was buried and raised the third day. I didn't know that. So I was spiritually vulnerable. That's what I call that little period of time. Spiritual vulnerability. The enemy didn't want to lose his grip on me. And this went on for about 10 months until Jesus finally set me free through a friend of mine. She came and she invited me to a church on Long Island where we live. And I went. I declined her invitation at first. And I went a month later, and that was the day. The Lord woke me up that day and said, you got to go to this church today. And that was the day I was saved. I heard the gospel and I believed it. And I was saved.
Wow. Dr. Gallagher, you occupy a very unique place in that you're a psychiatrist and a physician who nevertheless is brought in to help in these situations. I suppose part of what you're helping people do is assess whether or not the problem that they're facing is actually spiritual in nature, or if it's something more biological or biochemical happening. A question I've always had about this, it strikes me that because we're ensouled creatures, because we're ensouled bodies, we're embodied souls. I'm sorry, it came out of my mouth backwards, and then I confused myself. Ensouled. What am I trying to say? Because we're embodied souls. Can problems in the physical world become spiritual problems? And can problems in the spiritual world become physical problems? Does the door actually swing in both directions?
Well, Jeremy, it's a complicated field.
Certainly.
And all kinds of strange things happen. There can be, there's some kind of interpenetration of spiritual forces in the human psyche and the human body. So, as a physician, obviously, I'm very careful to, keep my scientific hat on, and I do believe in mainstream science. On the other hand, you'll get cases where demons can cause physical pain. I'm sure Billy and Jenn have seen this, can cause physical pain. Conversely, if someone has certain, especially psychiatric issues, it's not that, demons are causing them. It's that they can be vulnerable and somehow turn to darkness, turn to the kind of things you were talking about, and or simply be so vulnerable as individuals that they unwittingly open themselves up to this stuff. So you're right, it can work both ways,
Yeah.
I like to, you mentioned my being a psychiatrist, and I often get the question, well, Dr. Gallagher, how does it feel to be out of the mainstream? And I always answer in the same way. Because, look, I know psychiatrists, and I did for many, many years before I was asked to be involved in this field. We all know patients who hallucinate, demons, aliens, FBI, all kinds of things. So, psychiatrists who tend to be a little less religious as a group anyway, tend to be more skeptical of this stuff. But when people ask me, am I out of the mainstream? I say, depends on what you call the mainstream. Most Americans, a lot of them have turned to the occult, even if they believe in evil spirits too. So most Americans believe in evil spirits. Around the world, if you're really, knowledgeable about different cultures, most people around the world believe in evil spirits. My book was translated into several languages, including Japan. So I asked this Japanese woman, and Japan is essentially a pagan country. I said, so how is the reception over there? And she said, well, Dr. Gallagher, you have to realize we're not a Christian country, but we all believe in evil spirits. Yeah. And then I'm a great lover of history. I studied classics at Princeton. And what had struck me, even in my undergraduate days, was pretty much everyone believed in evil spirits. Now, they may have had different interpretive frameworks. Some people, believed that the gods and goddesses worked evil as well as good. In the Muslim religion, they believe in jinns, who are these spirits who can be intermediate and work evil and good. But, if you get back to the question of, am I in the mainstream? Historically, and I'm a lover of history, I am in the mainstream.
Firmly in the mainstream.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. Well, because the data does back that. American Bible Society just did a survey around investigating the supernatural, and it found obviously more than half of Americans believe in all these things, and they tend to believe more in heaven and heaven and God and the positive things, but even the majority believe in hell and the devil and evil. And so that is a mainstream perspective, no matter what certain facets of the public want to say.
There's a sort of cultural, a kind of cultural Christianity that exists apart from scripture, apart from actual church tradition, but that lives in sort of the popular imagination. It's the cherubim with the harp and
the baby angels.
The baby angels. Yeah, like all of that just sort of exists even culturally in a way. I sometimes wonder, and obviously these are questions that are unknowable, and the apostle tells us to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. I sometimes wonder how much of what people believe about angels and God, and conversely about demons and the devil and about heaven and hell, are actually these sort of cultural artifacts more than they are, the substance of the thing that's found in Christ. And I wonder if, in that way, believing in these things, even the positive things that people believe in, is actually a gateway for mischievous forces to operate in their lives. Satan comes as an angel of light, right? That it's actually the good things that people believe in that can do the most damage spiritually.
Well, yeah, I mean, even think about what Jenn was saying before. People are coming because they're desperate.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times when I met Jenn, it really struck me that I had never thought about a psychic. I always thought, okay, psychics are just evil. What they're doing is terrible. And obviously what psychics are doing, it is terrible. But she really believed she was helping people. I never had that perspective before. So to what you're even saying, the assumption that you're doing something good, the assumption that you're working towards something good, even for the people coming, even for what you were doing, I think that's really important. The other side of it is that, yeah, we have this framework about what all of this looks like, and a lot of it is shaped by Hollywood. And we've talked about this before, but I think this is really important, and I'm going to keep saying it, because we are not actually, and when I say we, people in the church, creating content and creating narratives or even talking about these things in our churches enough, we've actually ceded all that information over to Hollywood and the media to craft it, and we're not doing anything. We're letting them talk about a church topic the wrong way more than we in the church are actually talking about it the right way. So that's another piece of why things have been shaped that way.
I agree with that. I mean, we can't be afraid of the darkness that the Bible is clear about. We need to be able to step into these arenas and share the truth, which comes from God's word, and not shy away from it. And I totally agree with you, Billy, that this cultural Christianity is coming because people are getting discipled by experiences. They're getting discipled by Taylor Swift. They're getting discipled by social media influencers, TikTok, witch talk, and all those sorts of things. Even when you want to say something good, like an angel or something like that, they'll go to the angel cards. They're being discipled by the New Age. They're not going to the Word of God. So if you're going to call yourself a Christian, you need to go to the authority, which is God's Word, where He defines heaven and hell, and He tells us about angels. And the spiritual battle, which I think we really need to touch on, right? Because this is all happening because there is a spiritual battle being fought in the heavenlies. The Bible is clear about that in Ephesians 6. So there is this invisible battle going on to influence souls. So however the enemy can do it, like you said, disguising himself as an angel of light, he's going to make it look good. It's not often that he comes as the little red guy with the horns and the tail. Instead, he'll come as the solution to your problems and your dreams come true. And he'll dress it up, he'll romanticize it, he'll glamorize it. And our country is being just lost my word for a second.
Compromised, essentially, evangelized.
Desensitized and desensitized. Kind of like what you guys were saying earlier, desensitized by the chronic, watching of it on social media, the movies, listening to it. It's everywhere you go. As a matter of fact, it's very rare, and I would be interested to hear what you have to say, Dr. Gallagher, I'm sorry. I would say that everybody's going to encounter the New Age and the occult. Walk into your CVS, walk into Barnes & Noble, turn on your television these days, go on social media, you're going to see it. But like you said, Billy, to your point, if the church isn't going to talk about it, how are the congregants going to know? I mean, of course, we have a responsibility to read our Bibles, right? But you really should be informed.
Dr. Gallagher, in people's day-to-day experience, how much of what we encounter is what it appears to be? And how much of what we encounter is actually being driven by spiritual forces?
Well, I do think Americans are known, as opposed to, say, Europeans, they're known for what we call religiosity. We are a culture that has always, and to some extent still is, apropos the statistics that Billy gave, still kind of culturally Christian, or, some other faiths too. I do regard, my colleague's observation that a lot of it is very superficial. And those people are unquestionably very vulnerable people. Now, again, people have to keep in mind, it's not entirely new. Even the heyday of spiritualism, Jenn, as you probably know, was the end of the 1800s and the early 20th century. There were estimates of at least 10 million spiritualists in this country and in Europe.
Wow.
Brazil is still filled. Brazil has, kind of what we call a syncretic religiosity. And, many people follow, a guy named Allan Kardec, who was a French spiritist. Even the Renaissance, not to get too in the weeds here, was very, we talk about it being the age of enlightenment as if it was all secular. It wasn't. There was a lot of belief in magic and the occult. So on the one hand, there is nothing new under the sun. On the other hand, I think the situation in America is quite complicated. So as people have moved away from more mainstream churches, they fill the void with something. And a lot of people, unfortunately, are turning to New Age, not realizing the darker side that Jenn had pointed out. It's also an opportunity, I think, and certainly there are certain religious groups where young people are actually coming back to the church, far less than are leaving.
Yeah.
So we have to be realistic about that. But it's interesting, too, that younger people, as opposed to the older generation, have been so brought up on movies, podcasts, the internet, discussing these issues, that in a way they are more open to serious discussions, such as we're having today, about this age, because so many of them are confused. But it's also an opportunity to actually appeal to them, because in some ways, they have a more complicated understanding of good and evil than even their parents had.
Yeah. If somebody is open to even the occult, and we don't want that obviously, but they have an openness to something bigger than themselves, I think that it's a lot harder to work with an atheist who doesn't believe. And because there's this sudden openness, this goes back to the church. Like, what is the church going to do to meet this need? We have not done a good job on this topic. That's why it's so important that you're doing this tonight, that we're having this conversation. When I wrote a book around the same time you did in 2020, I remember going out and trying to get people to endorse this book. It was called Playing with Fire. It was about this issue. Came from a Christian perspective. There should have been nothing in it that was a problem for people. It was easier to get Hollywood actors to endorse the book than it was some pastors. And it was the most alarming thing at the time. And I remember saying to the publisher, what in the world is going on that I can go to this person or that person and they will do it? So we've got to wake up and not be afraid to talk about it. We don't want to find a demon under every rock, right? But we want to have a reasoned conversation, because to what you were just saying, it's actually an apologetics tool for reaching people, actually. And it's also a huge part of the faith. If you're going to walk around saying you're a Christian and never talk about good and evil, Ephesians 6 is the baseline of it. It explains we are in a battle. You can't win a battle you don't know you're in. And if we're not telling people that they're in a battle, well, good luck. We're setting people up for failure and to be potentially trapped in some dangerous spiritual situations.
We talk about cultural Christianity, but there's sort of the number one cultural religion of our time is cultural scientism. I say cultural scientism because everyone basically, even in the church, even Christians, like our foundational beliefs about the world are actually materialist assumptions. And they're not even modern materialist assumptions. They don't take quantum into account. Our view of the world is like a 150-year-old version of what scientists used to think. And we pat ourselves on the back and think that we're very modern, we're very cutting edge, because we believe things that people thought before Oppenheimer, and that's basically how we see the world. But because of that, even the church doesn't really see the world in spiritual terms. I've talked a lot lately about how the church has retreated largely in this country from politics, and there's a variety of reasons why. The seeker-sensitive movement, I think, is part of it. I think that the sort of excesses of the moral majority toward the end, the corruption that was exposed in the moral majority, the ascension of Donald Trump, which seemed to make evangelicals both fairly and in some cases unfairly hypocrites because of the stances that they had taken maybe during, say, the Clinton impeachment compared to the stances that they took in 2016 once Trump became the nominee. And for all of those reasons, politics has become somewhat anathema to most Protestant, in particular evangelical Protestant ministers in this country. But the spiritual component of life has done something similar, and for similar reasons. It became so unfashionable in the face of prevalent cultural scientism to even address those things that one would feel themselves a fool really to even engage in the conversation. It sounds like you're talking about mumbo jumbo, hocus pocus. None of this could possibly be real. That's not to say that the church doesn't acknowledge the spiritual. Of course it does. But it acknowledges the spiritual in only the sort of narrow sense of salvation, that in Christ we come from death to life, that in Christ we move from unrighteous to righteous, that in Christ we have adoption into the household of God eternally. And of course that is the gospel. That's the most beautiful. If you're going to only focus on one thing, it's supposed to pick a heck of a thing to focus on. But we are ignoring a great deal of the experience of humans. When we ignore politics, we're essentially ceding the care for material man, for the bodies which house our souls, which are just as much us as not us. We cede that to people who are willing to talk about politics. And when we cede discussion of the spiritual doesn't go away. We're also giving up that entire domain of human experience to people who are willing to talk about it. It's not surprising when you read that 30% of Christians roughly engage in tarot or psychic readings. Well, they have spiritual concerns that are not being met by the people who are supposed to be equipping us to deal with spiritual reality.
Go out into a battle without a weapon. That's what you're doing. You're sending people out into a battle without the proper weapons or shields. And it's incredibly dangerous and damaging. On the political front, I will comment on that. I think it's really interesting, the parallels, because I would actually say I think it's very tied to this. This is my opinion. I think, the enemy loves nothing more than for us not to talk about it, because these are issues. It's not about telling people to be a Democrat or a Republican. It's about talking about real life issues that are biblical issues, the gender issue, the life issue. We can go down the line. These are not just political issues, they're life issues. And one of the biggest lies has been, this separation of church and state lie that has been weaponized and used to silence people, make them feel like they can't speak out, make them feel like it's a weird thing to do. So don't ever talk about politics. No, this is life. And guess what? The other side, the secular side, they love it too, because guess what? They're talking about it because their religion, their secular religion, all of these things are huge facets of it. So, there's a spiritual element to that as well, though, that I think is at play and has really tricked a lot of pastors and churches into not speaking the truth. And you have people like Sophie Cunningham. We've relegated the truth to basketball players and to people like Riley Gaines.
That's a pretty hard word there, brother.
It's the truth.
So I think that people who are watching this conversation, it feels very abstract. So how do we bring this into really practical terms for people? When we say that there is a spiritual domain, when we say that, as Hamlet said, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy, that the materialist worldview is useful. Naturalism has been very good for when I turn a switch, the lights come on. That's never been true in all of human history. It took rationalism to arrive at that. When it's hot outside, it's not hot in here. That's great. We have medicines that can treat us when we're sick. That's wonderful. We have psychiatry that can treat us when our mind is sick. These are wonderful products of materialism. But the materialist, naturalist, scientific, whatever term we want to use for the sort of Enlightenment forward age of reason, and science, that has been a useful tool for the advancement of certain material considerations, but it's not the only tool. We took a sort of new technology, which is really what science is. The scientific process is itself a technological advancement that helped us deal with the material world and get great results out of the material world. But we turned that into an underlying set of assumptions about the human experience and creation itself, that because science was good for science things, it must be the only thing that's good for anything. And we turned our back on this entire the question of the spiritual at all.
Well,
to the extent that we've done that, some people listening at home may say, I don't even understand the context of this. Like, what is this spiritual world that we're talking about? What use does it have to think about it?
See, what has struck me in the, by now, long experience I've had dealing with people with serious demonic problems. I was brought up Christian, and I sort of always believed stories in the gospel about possession and stuff like that. I thought they were largely credible, but I thought a lot of this stuff was much rarer than I thought. I am committed to science.
Yeah.
But, the word science originally comes from a Latin word meaning knowledge. It didn't mean the scientific method. And people, I think, are confused about science because not everything can be proven by science, history and most of what we know about our friends and everything, it's a type of real knowledge. It's not subject to a lab experiment. So one of the reasons I wrote my book, Demonic Foes, was to really document in the modern age these dramatic cases of possession, which are not common, but are not rare as most people think. And, I often tell people every 2 years I go to a meeting of the International Association of Exorcists. I have to tell people I am not an exorcist, but, I have been a consultant. And, the kind of stories I tell in my book, there's 300 people around the world who have the exact same stories. Now, those are the clergy who are very faithful to the Gospels. And, people aren't necessarily listening to them. But, in some ways, because I have medical credentials, they listen to me. I had a guy who was a big writer on spirituality, and he said, Rich, I envy you because He said, I'm writing for the choir. You know, the only people who listen to me are people who are already religious, whereas you're willing to write about things that, you know, not only scare people a little bit, which is not the reason I write about it, but also grab people's attention. And so, you know, I think I've been a little more accepted by the public as trying to be as rigorous as possible. I'm making another analogy. You know, when St. Paul went to the Corinthians, he said, yes, I've heard the story about the resurrection of Jesus. I believe it. But you don't have to believe me. You can believe these 500 other people who saw him, and most of them are still alive. And I feel the same way with the kind of work I do. You don't have to believe Dr. Gallagher, even though he has, you know, pretty good credentials as a professor of psychiatry. Just, you know, talk to the people in this field who are knowledgeable. Because what I find about people mostly in America, and there are a few members of these skeptical organizations who are really doctrinaire materialists. By and large, I don't think they know what they're doing. And if you talk to a good scientist, they know the limits of science. I think most people are just a little bit confused about this stuff. Even if they're semi-Christian or they turn to the New Age, they're still potentially open to hearing about this stuff if it's presented. And unfortunately, sometimes, as Billy said, they do turn to their own churches, and their own churches are unprepared to really, you know, get down to the nitty-gritty. You know, I teach at a seminary. As I said, younger people are sometimes so exposed to, you know, demonic possession and all that from the movies that they're much more open to these ideas than the older generation. And believe it or not, the younger seminarians tend to be much more faithful in these areas, as opposed to some of their older peers long in the tooth who, you know, were of the generation of skeptics.
Jenn, you wanted to help people.
Yes.
You were channeling forces beyond yourself.
Mm-hmm.
What did they want?
The entities, the demons, they wanted the people that I was relaying this information to stay away from Jesus Christ, to stay away from the truth and be separated from God by the sin of divination. They wanted them to be deceived into believing that they could communicate with the dead, that they should go to the medium and not to God, that this could offer them some sort of closure or peace or joy. And meanwhile, it's just counterfeit. It's temporary and unfulfilling because only Christ can offer that. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Demons are liars. They're liars, they're counterfeit, and they're deceivers and manipulators. And they're evil, and it's cruel. And they wear masks. They masquerade, and they will pretend to be your deceased child and prey on what Dr. Gallagher keeps talking about, vulnerability, the vulnerability of the human flesh, sadness, grief, loneliness, desperation, as you mentioned, Billy. This is the reason why people go to see mediums. But that's what those demons want. They want to lure you away from Jesus and keep you on the line, all to throw you in the trash can.
Dr. Gallagher, when you think about the purposes of these entities and the people you've encountered who've been oppressed or possessed, are they all unbelievers?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Are who all unbelievers?
People who are possessed by demons.
No. It's a very complicated subject, and that's why I wrote the book. You know, because there are different types of possessions, there are different types of what we call oppression. There are, by and large, the people who get possessed, which is kind of the nth degree of a demonic attack, they have turned to either the occult, and many people coming out of a spiritualist background have made themselves vulnerable. Usually there's also some element of turning to evil or turning to sin. And the combination or a preponderance of one or the other, you know, is really what makes people vulnerable. at least to the most serious attacks. But, some people can have more minor attacks. There's a lot of different terminology. I won't bore the audience with all the technical terms, but people who have more minor attacks called oppression, they may get physically attacked, they may get mentally attacked. Again, there are different reasons why that happened. Some of them, and this is sometimes challenged by certain Christians, some of them are good people who are now trying to turn back to Christianity, and so they get punished for doing that.
Yeah.
Others have just, had a more minor flirtation with the occult, with spiritualism, with New Age stuff, and they get in over their head. Now, if they are brought up Christian, as most people in America still tend to be, with many exceptions, they hear, like Jenn did at some point, well, you need to turn to Christ. And that is true. That is the way to get past, a serious demonic attack. Because it's not a magic exorcism, for instance. I know most of the major Catholic exorcists in the United States, they will all tell you what I'm going to say. Exorcism is part of a pastoral ministry. It's not a magic ceremony. It's not like a witch doctor. You say the magic words. As a psychiatrist, I'm dealing with people who they want the magic pill and all their problems will go away. It doesn't work that way. You have to turn to Christ. But there are different reasons people get even possessions. Curses are something we don't talk about much in this country, whereas in a lot of other countries, like Italy, I'm aware of, and Haiti, they very strongly believe that that's another factor that can happen to people. It can be exaggerated. I mean, I remember dealing with a woman who came from sort of a Spanish aristocratic background, and her parents insisted to me that she was affected very severely demonically because her great uncle had been a Freemason. Now, it's not a completely outlandish idea, but when I talked to the woman privately, she said, well, I don't believe what my parents are saying, but they don't know that I've turned to the occult for many years. So these are why it requires, careful discernment of each case, what is leading to this, and, why I often get called in.
So I have two follow-ups. One, when someone is dealing with demonic oppression because of a curse, is the person who cursed you're ascribing a certain amount of power to the person who cursed them. And a related question, to the extent that Jenn was channeling demonic entities, was Jenn and you don't have to diagnose Jenn on the spot, but a person doing such a thing, we're ascribing to them a certain amount of power and authority. Is it necessary then to conclude that Jenn herself was possessed by these?
Well, I don't know that she can answer for herself. I don't know that she was really possessed, but you talked about going through a period where you absolutely felt you were attacked. And I'm not saying, she was a super vulnerable person, but because, as she acknowledges, she hadn't put on the armor, the spiritual armor that St. Paul talks about, she probably was vulnerable.
But there's a step beyond just vulnerability, to the extent that she was, for 2.5 decades, channeling these forces on behalf of others, or to the extent that a witch in Haiti casts a spell or casts a curse against another person, and that person becomes, in your view, authentically spiritually oppressed. From whence does the power to do that thing derive?
Well, again, people throughout all history, Jeremy, as you probably are aware, people have turned to black magic.
Yeah.
They get something out of it.
Yeah.
If they didn't get something out of it, it's not just superstitious. The demons allow them to do that. They've ensnared that person, but they also have some power over enemies, people who pay them money to take care of my unfaithful husband,
Mhm.
they have, there's no question, they have genuine black magic powers. Again, there's nothing new about that. I mean, the Bible condemns that, the Bible condemns spiritualism.
Mhm.
So
And
in one sense,
speaking
there's
to the
nothing,
dead and
in one sense, there's,
Necromancy.
which was called necromancy.
Yeah.
In one sense, there's nothing new under the sun.
Can I just add something quick to that?
Yeah, I wish you
I've
would.
thought a lot about this, in covering a lot of news stories, right, outside of this realm too, even looking at Nigeria right now. You look at this horrific situation where you have Christians being slaughtered, right? And we have no promise of not being affected by evil as Christians. We have no promise. I mean, the early church, my goodness, right? You look at the apostles, what happened to them in tradition. So, but I've thought about that, and I've thought, as we're talking about curses, I think about, extremism, religious extremism that is driving the killing, much of the killing that is happening in Nigeria of these Christians. You can have evil that is driving something that is still impacting believers. They're not necessarily protected from it. And that's a separate issue from what we're talking about, but it is related. And I've been thinking a lot about what role, because I host a podcast, Into the Supernatural, where we talk about this persecution issue. What role does evil play in that? And even thinking that through. So on the curse front, you often wonder, if somebody puts a curse on you and you're a Christian, are you protected? Well, maybe you are, but maybe the other person that's being cursed to do something evil potentially could even be affected by it. So there's so many moving dynamics in that are very complex and difficult to pin down, but there's real power in it.
Right. If you're a strong Christian, you're going to be more protected.
Yes.
And if you're not, you're going to be more vulnerable.
I suppose I think about this glass. And if we are the glass,
Mm-hmm.
if the glass is filled with the Holy Spirit,
Mm-hmm.
then there can still be attacks on the glass,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing can be in the glass
Right.
because the Spirit of God is in the glass. And so this may not be how everyone, we may not have agreement among the four of us about this, but this has been my view of it going through my life, is that certainly the Christian experiences evil,
Oppression
even oppression, but possession would be a different degree, because it would seem to me that in order to be possessed, one has to not already be possessed by the Spirit. I mean, I'm abusing the term there, but in other words, the glass has to be empty of Christ in order for the glass to be filled with.
Yeah.
I think
demon.
I think that's largely true of the most severe cases. You're protected.
Yeah.
But there's no question that sometimes very holy people and people turning back to Christ and even open to the Holy Spirit, they still can be attacked, because the demons feel like, we had you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We had you when you were, a spiritualist. Now we're really pissed off that you're turning to Christ.
We're coming
So
at you.
now you're going to pay somewhat of a price.
But
That happens too. I've had people come from certain, I'm going to use the word fundamentalist cultures, and they get shunned by their church if they have any kind of attack.
Yeah.
And I think that's a shame, because it's often at the point where they're actually trying to deepen their Christianity.
I've been told by.
I will make one more
Please.
comment. The people who are most at sea, though, are the people who start out atheists without any openness, because they don't know who to turn to, and they certainly don't think of turning to Christ. They're the ones who sometimes consult me, and I have to start from the beginning, because, they just want relief, but they don't know who to turn to.
Yeah, there are varying degrees. I agree 100% with your assessment and what you were saying of oppression. Oppression can look very much, and you've seen this more than anyone, can look very much like a possession almost. It's not a possession necessarily, but the intensity of it on a person, depending on what they've opened themselves up to, depending on what they're, I've seen cases where people have woken up in the middle of the night and they felt like their hands are moving. It's an external thing, but it feels internal, right? So I think it really just depends, but I do agree with that. And going back to Ephesians 6, what do you have to do in this to be protected? I think that's the thing. I think we overcomplicate this. When you read through that, it doesn't say, well, if the devil might attack you, it seems to say the devil is going to come at you, right? And so are you prepared for it? Well, what does that prep look like? Are you reading your Bible? Are you praying? Are you living a Christian life? Are you being a good, solid Christian who has a relationship with the Lord, not just a nominal Christian? And are you living that out? That, to me, not to oversimplify, that is the protective gear. That is what the shield of faith is. That is what we're called to do. And so I think we're not teaching that well enough. We over analyze all these other pieces. That's what we have to do to be protected.
Yeah. And God allows it. God allows these attacks. I mean, we know the demons have to get permission from God. Demons have to get permission from the Lord. I mean, we see that in the Bible. We see Job in the book of Job. I mean, God gave the devil permission to afflict Job. We also see it when when Jesus was casting the demons out and they asked to go into the swine. They had to ask the Lord's permission to do that. So I would say if a witch was to, because people ask me this question a lot, how can I know if someone's doing witchcraft on me? And you know what I say? You can't 100% know because you're not God if you're not seeing a person doing witchcraft on you or they haven't told you. However, you can be suspicious of it if you start to have these oppression symptoms, if you will. You know, sleep paralysis, nightmares, experiences like you just mentioned, maybe an acute anxiety or depression, or you don't want to read your Bible all of a sudden, you don't want to go to church. Either way, the solution is always the same. This is the spiritual warfare. Jesus is the solution, turning to him and asking him to rebuke these demons. And I would add to that, to show you where you may, it doesn't mean that you do have a door open, but if you do, ask the Lord to show you. Did you participate in a yoga class because somebody said it was holy yoga or Christian yoga? Did you click on the Christian who said that they were a Christian witch or psychic on TikTok and maybe entertain getting a reading? So you have to be very aware of those things. I'm not saying that's always the reason by any means.
Even.
Or
I mean,
perpetual sin,
which is one that gets talked about the least. You brought it up before.
Yeah.
I think it's uncomfortable, so people don't want to talk about it. Is there something that you're engaging in?
Yeah.
I mean, like, pornography is something that people struggle with. It's an open door. It is absolutely an open door, not just for the people working in the industry, who I've dealt with a lot of those stories, but for the people consuming it and obsessively consuming it and being addicted to it. That is one door. Drug use, right? I mean, there are a lot of other things on the sin front. Just to add that into that, I would agree with what you said.
Absolutely, 100%.
It must be the case that people with high profiles, politicians or movie stars or podcasters, which I think is germane to this conversation, to the extent that they're known very, very broadly, to the extent that they, in the cases of some podcasters or politicians, they at least appear to be powerful. They have influence in places where public policy gets created. It must be the case that those people have spells and curses being sent their way all the time, whether they're aware of it or not, simply by the number of people who oppose them. I mean, if you're Donald Trump, for example, you're the most famous person in the world, 7 out of 8 billion people on planet Earth could pick you out of a lineup. And you presumably can make policy that can impact the lives of hundreds of millions of those people. I would just imagine that a lot of this gets thrown your way. And of course, I suppose on the other hand, a lot of people pray for you too.
Yeah.
There was a Reddit thread, and who knows how true this was. You might have seen this, where there were witches talking about Donald Trump and talking about this very issue, and they were talking about putting curses on him. And this one witch wrote, the frustrating part of this is that basically she could feel the prayers. It was ineffective because she could feel the prayers of the Christians that were praying for him. And I thought, if that's true, it's exactly what you just described, and it's very interesting. And it's, I mean, again, it calls us back to Ephesians 6. What are we supposed to be doing? But I remember reading that and thinking that is super interesting.
So when we look across the podcast landscape in particular, and we see so many people on the right invoking demonic experiences, in the case of Tucker, invoking experiences of hell in the case of Sean Ryan as a result of his use of psychedelic drugs. What are we to make of that phenomenon? Because if we go back in time 5 years, no one talked about these things. This, it could just be that this is trendy. It could be that I suppose there's a question of, can demonic oppression itself be a social contagion? Can it be something that becomes in vogue and popular, and so people sort of unwittingly invited onto invited onto their own lives and into their own experiences? Is it just cynicism and showmanship? Are people invoking this because it's in vogue, and they're cynically saying this happened, but it didn't actually happen? Would that in itself be, would that kind of cynicism itself open them up to demonic attack or demonic oppression? There's a lot there. I realize there's like 8 questions in one, but we're certainly going through a moment here where we're experiencing a change in our online conversation around these issues. I suppose I'm asking why.
I mean, it's a very good set of hypotheses. You really have to take each case individually. You really do. You were talking about God's will. There's a difference, as you know, between God's permissive will, what he permits, versus, some kind of activity from God. I think probably all of us in this room are somewhat providentialists. We don't know the whole story. And we know that people have such a variety of reasons that they may turn off the beaten track. They may get attacked in different ways. You have to take each case individually. And I would like to think, certainly for myself, that, it's ultimately a mystery up to God's providence why this is allowed to happen to certain people and not to others. But you really have to look at each case individually because of the many hypotheses you just raised. It could be a combination of factors. It could be any one of them.
In your experience, do psychedelic drugs often provide a gateway to these sorts of encounters?
Yes. And they lead to all kinds of weird experiences. I mean, I don't think I'm puritanical, but, to use substance abuse in a, somewhat destructive way, that in itself is sinful, in my opinion. And it's a destruction of the, temple of God, the body. And it's also a type of curiosity that killed the cat. That, you're curious about spiritual experiences. You think that these experiences are going to open a door, but they're opening a door to a very unhealthy realm, and a realm that is intentionally trying to fool you. I do not believe that people taking psychedelics ever reach a higher level of consciousness because of that. And there are many people who disagree with me, but I'm convinced that those people often get in trouble. People who go to spiritualists often get into trouble. People who turn to sin or evil. I've had some gangsters who have gotten themselves very possessed. For a while, it seems like a good bargain. I write about in the book a gangster who was on top of the world for a while. All of a sudden, he had, all the girls he wanted and all the cars he wanted, and he was on top of the world. He was a Mexican-American who had been devoted to the Mexican cult of Santa Muerte until he crashed. And then given his immersion in a terrible world of crime and gangsterism, he got possessed. But there are a lot of people who get lesser attacks.
I mean, Hitler got everything he wanted until the bunker.
Exactly.
Making deals with the devil doesn't always, in the short term.
It's a very bad bargain, which you have to convince people of sometimes.
So I know these, a lot of, not just one, but a variety of veterans from the War on Terror, particularly guys who were in special forces who, there's a lot of like traumatic brain injury from using concussive explosives on doors for breach charges and other things. And then just the kind of stress and the kind of mentality that one has to carry in order to do that job effectively for the protracted time that many of them did it, who have found a lot of sort of therapeutic relief in certain psychedelic, for lack of a better, you would have better language for this, but, psychedelic drugs. And these aren't guys who were going to Mexico looking for a transcendent experience. They were looking for a therapeutic that could help them with this very particular issue of traumatic brain injury. And yet, one can imagine, I don't know everything about, say, Sean Ryan's story, and I'm not asking anyone to diagnose Sean Ryan in particular, but his story, as I understand it, he was an operator in the military. It's very possible that he pursued this as a therapy himself initially, but as he engaged with it more and more, it led him to have this experience to hell, this experience of hell. As a physician, who, because you have that very unique piece of your career that informs this, what is the right relationship between drugs that can be therapeutic and very useful to people in very particular moments in time? I think about SSRIs, which I think, I would posit that women in this country are abusing SSRIs, but I'm not opposed to SSRIs per se, because I suspect that there are some subset of the 20% of women currently using them actually are finding true therapeutic relief in the form of these drugs. How do you, when as a psychiatrist, weigh that challenge in the balance when you're trying to decide how to treat someone?
Well, you're asking a guy who taught psychopharmacology for 25 years.
You're the right guy to ask.
So I hate to keep coming back to my mantra for the day, which is complicated. SSRIs can
This is
be...
a podcast, sir. We want sound bites. We'll travel around the internet quickly.
I know. As an
Easy,
academic,
clickable
I hate to oversimplify, though, because it's a very good question. I often say to my residents, you're asking a very good question. It has a complicated answer. SSRIs can be very, very helpful.
Yeah.
But at times, they can be misused. I'm not against all psychedelics, especially with the great interest now in psychedelics for things like, post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, probably the medication in that class that has shown its most promise, as you're probably aware, is ketamine.
Mm-hmm.
Ketamine does work properly used for depression. But then again, there are other celebrities who overuse it, and it causes a lot of problems. So once again, I hate to come back to the point. You have to look at every case individually. Can veterans benefit from admittedly still somewhat experimental psychedelic use? Yes, that's certainly possible. We don't have all the studies in yet. I was up at Harvard recently, and there was a discussion of this very point, and there was lively debate. But some psychedelics, ketamine used to be a substance of abuse primarily. They actually can be helpful. So it's not black and white, Jeremy.
Yeah.
I hate to not give you a simple sound bite here.
In a fallen world, every good thing can kill you.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're trying to guard ourselves against the sorts of encounters that we're discussing here, one has to tread very lightly when they make a decision to use something that opens themselves up to it in any way, I would imagine.
Well, where I have more objections is not people who are trying legitimately to find a medicinal purpose. That's my profession. Not that there aren't other modalities too, like therapies. But when somebody really turns to drugs, especially hallucinogens and stuff like that, they're asking for trouble if they think that is their path to a deeper spirituality. Mm-hmm. And I've seen so many people get in trouble when they do that. And they often have experiences like many religious visionaries throughout history that they think are genuine and they think are enlightening, and they're the very opposite. They're being fooled. People like who have astral projections. Mm. These are experiences that are illusions. To them, it's very real. And even some of the experiences of heaven and hell that you hear about, you have to be very careful because a lot of those experiences contradict each other. We're Aristotelian enough, I hope, that, things are either true or not true. If things are contradicting each other, some of those visionary experiences have to be illusions. Does that make sense to you?
In your experience, Jenn, you did astral projection, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I didn't, but I would completely agree with what you just said about it. It will feel real to the person, but I do not believe the soul is actually leaving the body. I think what's happening is those people are having psychic visions where they can actually report something, let's say that was in Billy's home. I astral projected and I saw Billy had this envelope on his coffee table, and I report this the next day and he says, "How could you have known about that?" That would have been a psychic vision. But to the point of psychedelics, I want to say that before I would do readings, I mean, I went into a trance-like state. I didn't use a psychedelic to do it, but I really don't see the difference. I used guided meditation and I got myself into a trance-like state. And when you change your state of mind, you are now opening yourself up to demonic entities where it is real. It is real, and they will, you will invoke them, they will come, and they will oppress you, give you information if you're a psychic or what have you, or give you a vision, like people who are taking ayahuasca and that of the like. So when the Bible tells us to be watchful and to be sober-minded, not to empty our minds and go somewhere else.
Going back to what you were saying before, the question about why, the why for Tucker and some of these others, why at this moment are these things sort of happening? It feels like a number of events have sort of either broken people or opened people or caused people to say more frequently, that was evil, right? I think Charlie Kirk's assassination, people saying that was evil. Some of the reaction to Charlie Kirk's assassination, people saying that is evil, right?
Yeah.
We don't relish in anybody's death. You know, the fact that it happened on a college, like that's just one event. I think we go back to COVID, that entire experience was probably a turning point for people. I think even, you know, looking at the psychiatry of that is kind of interesting and how we come out of that and what does that mean? There have been a lot of these events and moments that I think have led us to this recognition, maybe that was always there, because again, there's nothing new under the sun. That's my mantra for the day. But that there is good and evil. And if there's good and evil, what does that mean? And so you're seeing all of these big personalities start to grapple with that and talk about that. I do think there's a big spiritual dynamic to this, because I'll just bring up the big elephant in a lot of rooms right now on the right, which is Israel, right? This idea that there's this obsessive anti-Israel sentiment that comes along with some of this. That whenever I see that, I start to wonder, what's the spiritual component here? Because there's always a spiritual component to that when you see it. Not that you can't criticize Israel or have thoughts about Israel. It's the obsessive blaming Israel for everything that we see. So there's a lot of these moving parts in culture right now that I think are actually very theological at the moment. Why are all of these people on the right having that experience right now? I don't know, but I think it's interesting that many people on the right were mostly united around a lot of these issues and suddenly are not.
Yeah.
And that also rings true of, what does the enemy come to do? Steal, kill, destroy, divide, confuse. Those are the elements of what we're watching, not just in politics in general and culture, but particularly on the right now. So I guess I'll leave it there, but I think that's what's at hand.
Don't you think also it's because it's acceptable and it's okay? People have grown comfortable talking about these things because we've seen the enemy desensitize the masses. So he gives a little bit at a time, maybe starting to talk about witchcraft. And the reasons that you gave earlier, Jeremy, were on point. It is trendy. Witchcraft is a cash cow. It's not just sex anymore. It's witchcraft. It's the darkness. It's the occult. And it's been creeping in little by little by little. And then when we saw this explosion through social media, the entertainment industry. So whether you're a politician or a musician, you can feel free to talk about it now because it's out there. Do you think? I mean, that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, no, I do think, I do think that's true. And I think you're
Yeah.
just like watching these stories, watching what Candace is doing, watching what Tucker is talking about, and going back to Tucker's experience that you referenced at the top here. You know, clearly he seems to have had some sort of spiritual experience. Did that end for him? I don't know. What I know is we have a lot of dysfunctional conversation going on, and we have a lot of people splintering who were believing very rational things, who are now willing to believe things with no evidence. And that's another thing that's been very odd to watch. I mean, look, I've been working in media for a very long time now. I've never seen people embrace full stories and narrative the way that they are without evidence to this degree.
Yeah.
to this
It's a
degree.
feelings thing too. I
a
mean,
feeling.
they latch on to these podcasters, and they grow some sort of. I'm just going to say it. I mean, it looks to be idolatrous to me, to be honest with you, where they start putting what they're saying before what God says, and now they get. And the enemy is definitely behind this, because what spirit are they operating under, really, if you think about it? Because once they get this big following, then they start saying things. And who do you think is behind that? You mentioned Legion. We are Legion. And, I'm not here to throw Candace under the bus or anything, but I will talk about things that are in my wheelhouse. And when Candace had that dream, she stated and asserted that she spoke to Charlie Kirk, or that it was Charlie Kirk himself in that dream speaking to her. There you have necromancy once again. But she has such a large following, and people have grown so in love with her. I would say especially the youth, honestly, and going down that conspiracy theory rabbit hole, of course. But so then they latch onto the feelings and they want to defend her. But now the enemy is starting to trickle in his concepts and ideologies through these people. So it's really this very strategic breakdown, really.
Yeah, it's not an accident, I don't think, that a lot of the same women who blame or falsely accuse Erica Kirk in the assassination of Charlie also defend Lindsay Clancy after she murders gruesome, horrible murder for 3 children. Whatever the perversion is, it's very clearly around this idea of like secret knowledge. Only we see reality as it actually is. And it comes with these evil accusations against the innocent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's been primed for decades. I mean, this is like, we've talked about this. I think last time I was here, we talked a little bit about this, and I mentioned it at the top. When you are consistently putting out information that is so one-sided, and it's really frustrating to people, and they're like, you're not representing us. I think Christians and conservatives have felt this in parallel ways. The media, Hollywood, go down the line. We're not being represented properly. Then COVID hits, and you have a lot of questions about COVID after, but you're not allowed to ask the questions, right? And then after you're finding out, you're reading the text and you're seeing some things, and you're like, okay, you end up feeling like you were missing something. The truth wasn't there. Then you have these big events that happen. I mean, it's really the perfect storm for this sort of thing, spiritually, I think, but also practically. And so you have people who want that secret knowledge because they're like, well, we can't trust the things we've been told. We can't trust anything that we've been told, which is not true, but that's the danger of bias, right? That has been the danger of the bias the whole time, that everybody was saying, this is gonna be bad. This is gonna be bad. Hey, media, do your job. And now here we are. Everybody's a journalist when they're not, and everybody's trusting them. But I think the factor that remains, I think this is the most spiritual factor, is the fact that there are no facts, there are no details that back it up, and people are still willing to follow it. That's the piece that I feel is actually a little bit demonic, that I can't quite place why that is happening.
Well, I would say that the enemy is, in his craftiness, is creating the exact distraction by everybody focusing on those things and those people. What are you not focusing on? What are you not focusing on? Christ. You're not pointing towards Christ. You're not acting as Christ. If you are a professing Christian, why aren't you leading with Christ and the way that he tells us to be, right? Instead, you're operating under these other spirits, in my opinion. Whether you're a Christian, you can be influenced. We already established that. Be influenced by them. But now it's to lead people away from truth and from Christ. And there is always going to be an element of things that we don't know. The Bible says we're not going to know everything. Only God knows everything. We have to be okay in our faith. We walk by faith, not by sight, right? We need to be okay with not knowing and being content with what God does tell us.
One last thing, and then I'll turn it back.
No.
Because you're sparking a lot. I mean, what
Yeah.
you were saying in your monologue about, we were at this point where the gospel was exploding on college camp. It's exploding everywhere. And then in comes Candace Owens with, they did it. Like everybody did it. It's like Oprah giving a giveaway.
Cars away,
I mean,
yeah.
everyone's getting a car, You
killed Charlie
Yeah,
Kirk.
exactly. That's what but it immediately halted that move of God. And the only way I can make sense of it, whether she or others realize it or not, is that those actions, which I believe were motivated outside of them, have had that effect, unfortunately, on this.
Well, here's an interesting distinction. To the extent that you believe that what you were doing, you were trying to help people, but if we really break it down to what you were actually doing, You're actually giving people cause to believe that there were answers apart from the gospel,
Yes.
that there were answers to their spiritual pain outside of Christ. What Candace is doing in the world today is, in the name of Christ, in the name of the Catholic Church, she accuses people falsely. In the name of the Catholic Church, she peddles this horrible Jew hatred and anti-Semitism. In the name of Catholicism, Christ is king is the way she attacks Ben Shapiro, and now the way that she defends herself against any criticism from any quarters for the great evil that she's doing. She subverted, maybe single-handedly, the greatest revival yet of the 21st century in this country. In the name of Christ, Christ is king. That's if that is of a kind with what we've been discussing here, and if the purpose of what we've been discussing here is universal, that what these forces universally exist to do is keep people from putting their faith in the truth of Christ, then that's a very subtle manifestation of it. It's a very subtle use of, or a very subtle trick being used by these demonic forces to actually, in the name of Christ,
That's right.
keep you from putting your faith in Christ.
Yeah.
Is that uncommon?
I mean, it's often perverse for people to claim, the support of the Catholic Church or the support of Christ for particular beliefs. There was a famous scientist who said, be careful that you don't ascribe malice to people who are just ignorant. It's a good phrase, because a lot of the craziness that we see in America, including in American politics, is a combination, in my opinion, of ignorance and greed. Because, a lot of people want to make money off these type of beliefs, especially in the media. I mean, having said all that, it's a very tricky thing to know how much in a particular individual is demonically influenced. It's just very, very complicated. How much is our fallen human nature, especially all the greed we have in this country, versus demonic influence. Now, there's no question that, in a course that I give in demonology, we break down the categories. I'll give you the Latin for a second. Tentatio, which means temptation. We're all tempted. That doesn't mean, by the way, that everything bad we do is just because we're tempted. It's probably a minority of cases. Most of it is just our fallen human nature. And then there's oppression, and then there's possessio. There's always a spectrum, and how that sorts itself out with a particular individual. Tucker probably is a good example, because, first of all, I wouldn't presume to comment on Tucker's spiritual life, but, there are a lot of people who think he was turning back to Christ or finding Christ, and that maybe that's why he got attacked. Now, how much of other things that he seems to now be involved in, flirting with anti-Semitism, if you want to say that, how much is just, his wanting an audience versus direct demonic influence? I mean, who the heck knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't presume to try to, analyze him from a distance,
But when you hear his report of the encounter in February of 2023, it doesn't seem inconsistent with other instances that you're aware of that you would think are legitimate.
Well, I think
It's the kind of thing that can happen to a person.
I think he was right. He was sensed it, and sometimes when people go through these experiences, they're pretty darn aware that there's something very dark happening. In addition to the rigorous criteria, the scratches coming from out of the blue. I mean, I say to people get attacked. It's immaterial. If that's not an evil spirit, I don't know what it is, almost by definition. But again, exactly why it happened to him at that time, is probably known to God.
I do know, I had a conversation with someone who, not only the conversation with Rod Dreher, but someone else who discussed these issues directly with Tucker. And what they allege that Tucker said to them is that this has happened to him a few times over the years, always when he feels himself turning toward Christ, always when he feels himself drawing nearer to Christ.
That's, I think, why they get punished, why they punish him for doing that. And then how he's processed that, whether he's processed it in a healthy way, I think he probably should have talked to an exorcist. But I know there are people who think Tucker is somewhat anti-Catholic. I don't know if you've ever heard that. Whereas Candace apparently uses Catholicism as some kind of excuse. I'm the true Catholic here. You have to be very careful when people do things like that.
Yeah.
10 years ago, maybe even less, but 10 years ago, for Candace to do what she's been doing the way she's doing it, it would have been like 2% of the population would have been like, oh, we're going to entertain this, because there's what has shifted in the last 5 years, I think, especially, that we're willing to embrace that and accept that. And that everybody in this room knows people who believe it. Yeah. Everybody does. We all do. People we love, people we know, they're friends, and they're smart people. They're not stupid people. They're intelligent people. They're kind people. They're people who go to church with us, right?
Yeah.
That is alarming. And so the solution to it is what you're doing, I think, but I actually don't know this. I don't know the solution to it at this point outside of that. I mean, we could talk about it, but it's almost like a mind virus. I don't know, because I do think that the reaction, and I like what you said, we can't know whether or not it is spiritual. We don't know. But I actually think the reaction to it feels a little spiritual. How the public is reacting to it. That part of it, I feel a little less conflicted, saying it feels like the enemy is just sweeping through and deceiving people into believing it.
And there may be that component, and yet at the same time, we talked about the superficiality of so much American spirituality. It could also, Billy, be primarily a matter of ignorance,
and weakness, and ideological weakness. Yeah.
Is the answer the same in either instance? In other words, there's, I'll use the English, not the Latin. There's temptation, and there's oppression, and there's possession. And those are distinct from just the reality of the fallen world, the reality of what sin has wrought among us. There's the question, from whence Tucker's turn toward Jew hatred, from whence Candace's turn toward accusations against innocent people. By the way, no matter what you believe, Candace is making accusations against innocent people. One, because you're wrong in whatever you believe. If you don't believe she's making accusations against innocent people. And two, because she's made so many accusations, they can't all be guilty. Yeah. So some of these people are innocent.
Laugh, but it's the truth.
Like the Egyptians and the French and the Jews. Yeah. It's one or the other. I mean,
and Erica.
And Erica. It may well be that those actual turns, that those actual actions are not themselves temptation or oppression or possession, that they're being motivated by greed, to your point, that they're being motivated by narcissism, by the desire for fame and acclaim, by pain because of your previous relationship with Charlie. I mean, any one or combination of any of those sundry elements could cause one to behave in some of these ways. To borrow from Dr. Gallagher, people are complicated. Human motivation is complicated. But all of that exists. All of those things exist as the result of the fall. All of those things exist as a result of evil. And therefore, the answer in every instance, whether it's directly a spiritual manifestation or not, is spiritual. It's that Christ is the answer. The gospel is the answer to the problem of human evil. It may not be, and this is one of the challenges about faith, is that, and I believe you used this language earlier as well, Dr. Gallagher, that an exorcism, you said, isn't a magic spell. And so too, every aspect of our faith. There is no, there's mystery. I talk sometimes about how one of the worst things that can happen is for a husband cheats on his wife. He therefore proves that he's untrustworthy. Nevertheless, a marriage can only survive if a wife trusts her husband. And so the only path back to a healthy marriage is for her to trust in him. Now she knows that she can't. So it's one of the most difficult situations imaginable, but it doesn't change the reality. Only her trusting in her husband will ever result in her husband being trustworthy. But her trusting in her husband doesn't guarantee that her husband will be trustworthy, because there's always mystery in the things of God. You're called to trust your husband, but that isn't a magic spell. It isn't guaranteed to get you the outcome. It's just the only thing that could get you the outcome. Similarly, the only way that a wife can be worthy of love is if her husband loves her. But many a husband has loved his wife, and she nevertheless remained unworthy of his love, because it may be the truth that the only way for a wife to be worthy of love is if she's first loved. But that's not a magic spell, and it doesn't always get us to the result that we're hoping for. This is true, I think, across all, and so it's true here as well, that the only answer to these problems is the intercession of the Spirit. It is the completed work of Christ in us, our hope of glory. And yet, prayer isn't a magic spell that guarantees some sort of victory. Faith, even personal faith. I always imagine the man who prays that God will deliver him. He has a smoking habit. And he prays that God will deliver him, and God doesn't. He prays that God will deliver him, he doesn't. He prays that God will deliver him, he doesn't. Finally, he gets to heaven and he says, God, I prayed thrice that you would remove this thorn from my flesh. I prayed again and again and again that you would help me stop smoking, and you never did. And God's answer is going to be something like, wait, you think smoking was your biggest problem? Like, you couldn't even see the reality of the things that I was helping you with. You couldn't even see that you were so focused on this one acute, superficial thing. And so it's an unsatisfying answer to say to people that the answer to all of these challenges is that we seek God, but that in seeking God, we're not guaranteed that we'll get, at least in a temporal sense, answers to these problems. But it's the only answer I know to give.
Yeah, removing any instant gratification, which is what people love, people desire. They want instant gratification.
Even from God.
Even from God.
Yeah, I think, I said I don't know the answer, and I do. Obviously, that is the answer, right? And I think it brings you back to Ephesians 6, putting on the armor, but it brings you back to Jesus's words when, he was asked, what are the two most important commandments? Love God and love others. If you're loving God, you're going to cling to truth. You're going to die to self. You're going to die to all the things we talked about that we do in this country, the selfishness, all of that. And if you love others, you're certainly not going to accuse them of killing their husband. So, I think all of these things, if we were to come back to what he said is most important and live that life, and if the Spirit were to pour over all of us, that would be the solution to this. And, I would say the convicting thing on all of this is that I have not prayed enough for these people personally. I have not actually sat down enough to say, hey, you know what? You can be frustrated and mad about what these people are saying about friends of ours and people we know even, but are we sitting down and actually consistently praying for them? And I would admit that I'm not. And so after tonight, I'm going to be doing that more, actually, as I'm sitting here feeling that conviction on that.
Is this part of what it means to pray for your enemies? Is part of it to acknowledge that your enemies, that their only hope is the same thing? Their only hope is your only hope.
That's the love of others too. It's part of it.
Absolutely. I'll hold you accountable on that.
Yeah, you will. You should.
Yes, I will.
Definitely hold me accountable to that. No, it's important because prayer is powerful. And I think a lot of us part of Ephesians 6, again, to come back to it, right? It's this us versus them lie that we have, that the enemy has convinced all of us we're in an us versus them lie. Paul says that, and we're so consumed by that we think that's the main problem. But I think tonight we've made it clear that's not the main problem. We know the main problem is spiritual. But I think most of culture is built on that lie that it's Democrats versus Republicans. It's Candace versus Erica. There's something bigger going on behind all of this.
I know that there are questions that you guys, because of your work, have probably answered 1,000 times, but that an audience encountering these questions for the first time or encountering them anew, nevertheless, won't forgive us if we don't deal with them. And one of them is the question of Tucker discovers scratches on his rib cage. That implies that spiritual beings can do physical harm. Now, on some level, we can despiritualize and say, well, evil in the world can cause a bomb to fall on your house and kill you and your children. So we know that evil, of course, can kill you. And in fact, we're all going to die, physically, and it's going to always be because of evil, because the kind of death that we experience is a result of the fallen world. But that's different than saying that an attack that originates in the spiritual realm that isn't channeled through a material medium can nevertheless result in material harm. I mean, that is a concept that can be frightening to contemplate. That you could just be going about your business and be attacked by an invisible demon, and it can bloody you. So of course, people are going to have questions about this. How common is a physical manifestation like that in your experience? And are there limits on what spiritual beings can do to harm you physically? You know, can you be killed by something? Again, not a bomb falling on your house because of a fallen world, but an actual demonic attack.
Well, of course, your question grapples with the whole, what a lot of theologians have called the mystery of evil, which is broader than just the more narrow issue of do evil spirits, and how often do evil spirits physically or to some extent mentally, cognitively, I would use, attack people. You know, in my book, Demonic Foes, I use the term internal oppression versus external oppression. So external is, I do believe, something that happened to Tucker. You know, he had physical harm done to him, to his body, for some reason. Probably known to God, not necessarily known to us. In the course I teach at a Catholic seminary, we call those type of things oppressions. Obviously nobody's saying that he was possessed, but oppressions and possessions are, we use the terminology, which is very traditional. None of this terminology did I originate. Extraordinary attacks of the demonic, as opposed to the ordinary attacks, which are like everybody being tempted. And even just because you're tempted doesn't mean that explains all the sinfulness or ignorance in your life. So with the extraordinary attacks, I would say possession is rare, is very rare. Some people who write about my book say, oh, Dr. Gallagher went from being a cynic to a believer. I mean, it's completely false. I was never cynical. I always believed, even when I saw the Exorcist movie as a very young man, I knew that was based on a true case. It was highly fictionalized, but it was based on a true case of a kid from Maryland. So I knew these things could occasionally happen. But just to get a little biographical, when I was a resident at Yale, that was the period where there was something called the satanic panic, where people were seeing the devil everywhere. And I even encountered some people who told me these phantasmagorical stories about a minister they had who, slayed a baby right in front of them, And so I was, to some extent, I remain a skeptic. And when the priest who first asked me for my help in discerning a case said to me, Dr. Gallagher, this is a very tricky case. We think it's an oppression. Would you help us out? I said to him, Father, with all due respect, I'm somewhat of a skeptic in this field, precisely because of the experiences I had had. And he smirked and he said to me, well, then you're the perfect man for the job, because we like to go into these cases with a little, air of skepticism. Again, I'm talking about the extraordinary attacks. I think what has been the most eye-opening for me is that, yes, possessions are very rare. A real possession is very rare. Oppressions, not so rare. The type of thing that happened to Tucker. And also sometimes the fact that demons, I'm talking about non-psychiatric patients, I'm not talking about auditory hallucinations or something. I'm talking about people who have great messages in their brain that seem to be very coherent and motivated by some evil purposes to confuse them, to seduce them, blah, blah, blah. Those cases exist. I call them internal versus external oppression. They're not common. They are not common, but they exist. And they exist much more than I thought they exist. That's been the evolution in my thinking. So, I've done over probably about 1,500 consultations. Now, some of these on cases of people who believe or their clergy believes they may have had a demonic attack, I would say that 500 of those people were mentally ill and 1,000 had a serious attack. Now, I don't think that's a good percentage of the total picture, because by the time people get to me, they've already been screened.
Yeah.
They're usually intelligent enough to want to seek out a professional opinion. But there's no question in my mind, possessions exist. As I said, I go to this meeting in Rome every 2 years, 300 very well-educated priests, and I'm sure one could give example of, say, Protestant ministers who have a lot of experience. We know that possessions exist, but still, they're rare. When you talk about this other element of an extraordinary attack, oppressions, more common. Not everywhere, but more common. Does that answer your question?
And you've seen these sort of external physical.
Oh, absolutely. Many. The first case I saw, which I was asked to evaluate, was a Hispanic woman who came to see this priest who had asked for my assistance in New York. She came from about 2,000 miles away from out west. And her story was that she was being beaten up by evil spirits. Again, not possessed, beaten up. And she had bruises all over her body. So, we did a physical exam. We did do some x-rays and lab tests, because people can get bruises from having, blood disorders, including low platelets. I couldn't find anything that could explain the bruises. Although I also had to be careful that the husband wasn't beating the crap out of her and that this was just their cover story.
Right.
But why would she come 2,000 miles to see this priest who then recruited me? And I said to him, with all due respect, Father, I don't think there's anything medical or psychiatric going on with this woman. And he said, I thought so. And they got her spiritual assistance, and she had deliverance prayers. And within 6 months, she was healed. Now, that's a good example of a person who had a serious oppression. She was being literally beaten up. She would be lying in her bed. These bruises would come. Her friends and her family were there. They would see it. They were horrified. But until she got the spiritual help, extra spiritual help. But this was not a woman who had turned to evil or the occult or anything like that. I believe that she was attacked precisely because she was an incredibly charitable person who was bringing a lot of people to the faith. She was very involved with pro-life causes. She was like a salt of the earth person. And yet she was attacked precisely for that reason. So again, each case has to be taken individually.
And the follow-up, are there limitations to, can a spiritual oppression of that kind, a demonic oppression of that kind result in someone's death?
Good question, complicated answer. I mean, most of us believe, if you talk to most experienced exorcists, they will say God will not allow, because he's not causing any of this, but he's allowing it. God will not allow a person in a possessed state to kill somebody. Now, somebody who's a criminal could be possessed and have a murderous tendency. And that person, not because of a possession, could kill somebody theoretically. I often get calls.
But even in that instance, that's slightly different than what I'm asking, because the person who's possessed, then I at least could say, well, the thing in the spiritual is channeling through the man who is physical to do the murdering. I'm more asking, could the woman who had the bruises forming on her laying in bed have been beaten to death by invisible
No,
spiritual forces?
I don't believe that happened. I've never seen it, and I've seen more cases than I think any physician in history. I do not believe that would happen.
Are there cases where that you've seen? I mean, you look at scripture, right? You have the little boy who he's possessed, which obviously opens up lots of interesting theological questions. Little boy's possessed. He's being thrown into the fire. He's being thrown into the water to be drowned, right? Where you have these demons essentially trying to kill the host, right? In that case, because he was possessed and he does receive healing. In that, it often makes me wonder too, and I'm not saying this is the case in her case. Are there people who the bruises and cuts are coming from themselves and they don't remember it as a result of the possession or severe oppression?
Self-harm.
Yeah, like a self-harm type thing.
Well, again, you'd have to look at every case individually. In the case of this woman, she would be lying in bed,
And they would appear.
and people would see the bruises appearing, and she had nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
So again, you have to take each case individually.
It makes me
This
think,
this is what we call spiritual discernment. I mean, in my case, it's also medical discernment.
Sure.
And some of the cases are tricky. Now, I'm not saying they're all so tricky. Sometimes they're so obvious. I tell people, if somebody is levitating, if somebody all of a sudden speaks perfect Latin, and has seemingly superhuman strength,
Mm.
you sure as hell know something is going on. It doesn't take a professor of psychiatry to discern that.
I levitate.
Well, I have. That's odd.
And his Latin isn't perfect, but I've always been suspicious, deeply, deeply suspicious.
Well, I'll tell you, to be specific about it. I dealt with a Satanist who was invited to her exorcism. Tremendously possessed case. I had some questions about whether the priest should deal with her because they were doing exorcism, because she wasn't fully committed to, reform her life. In fact, she hadn't even left the cult. Now, I was invited to the exorcism, and I didn't go to it. The last exorcism she had. Now, I talked to 8 people, and they said for half an hour she levitated. I have spoken to about 40 people in my life. I've never seen a levitation. I've seen a lot of other things happen. I've seen a possessed woman throw a deacon across a church hall. I've seen people speak foreign languages. But she unquestionably levitated. And all these people I'm talking about, 40 people, including, a professor who was an exorcist in Europe that I know well, they all say, during exorcisms, this can happen. Because exorcisms are reported in the spiritualist world, by the way. I don't know how aware you are of that, but it's usually during a possession. Talk about Latin, I'll tell you a strange thing that happened to me just a couple of days ago. And I do wonder if it was slightly related to my appearing here today, just as I wonder about your computer. So I get a text from a woman who I know is possessed. Again, these are not patients of mine, by the way. I don't treat them because they usually need spiritual assistance much more than they need any kind of psychiatric help. I do think they need supportive people in their life, good supportive Christian people to support them through the process. But so this woman was unquestionably possessed, and I said, I'll give you the name. I'll give you the name of a psychiatrist who can, deal with you if you get depressed or something, because people can be possessed and depressed. But I'll give you the name of a exorcist in this area. And, she always refused to go to the exorcist, and she would keep calling me, and I'd say, Mary, not a real name. I never reveal people's names. I said, you're not doing what I tell you to do. I can't help you. You try to pray and think about my advice. So on Monday, before I was planning to leave for the trip, I get 10 calls in a row from this person, and I don't answer the phone because I'm not answering the phone for this woman in at this point, because I've already told her, I'm a very, very busy doctor. I'm I'm not going to answer every call this woman makes to me. But I also became suspicious because what I had wondered is, because I knew she goes into possessed trances, what I was wondering was if this was coming from her phone while she was in a possessed state. So finally, and I think that's probably what was happening, because, you know, she was a fairly polite person. I don't think she would call me 10 times.
Yeah.
I get a text. You can talk to a lot of exorcists, and I know some of the most prominent ones. They even say demons can send text.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a text. The first one is, "Answer, bitch." And I said to myself, this is not this woman. This is, the second one was in Latin. I studied Latin for 10 years. This woman did not know Latin. And, you know, to get back about the criteria, which should be very rigorous, you know, that is one of the criteria, that people speak a different language, have the ability to speak a different language. Last story, I was at a, unless you have all night, I was at an exorcism in the Midwest. And, you know, I go as an observer, you know, and sometimes, you know, the priest wants me there or the minister. So I go, and the woman goes into a trance. She's speaking a language that, you know, all of us could probably recognize was somewhat Slavic, right? None of us knew what she was saying. And this woman had never left the country. She knew no foreign languages. You know, we verified that afterwards. So at the end of the exorcism, we say to the priest, what was going on with that language? He said, well, I'm from Bulgaria. She was speaking to me in Bulgarian. And she did that for about a half an hour. She was speaking Bulgarian.
Wow.
So, you know, getting back to the whole issue of science, I am scientifically trained as a doctor. I'd be a very bad doctor if I didn't believe in the value of the scientific method. It can't answer all questions, but, you know, these are one of the rigorous criteria we use, and we do use rigorous criteria. The problem that the doctrinaire materialists make as a mistake is they seem to assume if you can't prove, it's like this guy Randy, remember the magician? You know, he always challenged people, do it under experimental conditions. They're not, I tell people, evil spirits are not Hollywood actors. They're not going to perform for the camera because they know their audience. They know we're speaking right now, by the way. Evil spirits know we're having a meeting about them right now.
Mhm.
But the doctrinaire materialists, they act like the only things that are really, really proven are things that can be experimented upon. You know, history is not like that. You know, I mean, you can't do experiments on George Washington crossing the Delaware. We know that happened, but we can't prove it scientifically. I put the kind of cases I write about, these extraordinary attacks of the demon, in the same category. This is history. There are hundreds of anecdotes about this. The famous skeptic David Hume had this famous phrase, the philosopher. He said, I think Carl Sagan repeated it. It was extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. By that he meant, oh, you know, all this hocus pocus about miracles and demons, it's all nonsense. Well, there is extraordinary evidence. The evidence is out there. I would include healings and miracles too.
Mm-hmm.
Miracles exist, not because, you know, there are few in history, but because there have been many in history. And demonic attacks exist, not because, you know, they're once in a century, which is maybe what I kind of originally believed, but because they're much more common. They're rare, but they're much more common. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love your point.
And that's why I wrote the book. You know, one final remark. I have a very good Jewish friend who he was an intern with me together when I was doing internal medicine. And you know, he's a Jewish background, but he's a good man. You know, he's a God-fearing man, I guess the Bible would have called him. He he read my book when it came out, and I've known this guy for 35 years. He's a very good friend of mine. He says, Rich, why the hell didn't you ever tell me you wrote this book? I said, well, Cliff, you're not a Christian believer. And I said to him, Cliff, so, okay, maybe I should have told you as a good friend, but, it just never came up between us. I said, what was your reaction to the book? He said, this is what I believe, Rich. Nobody can read that book and say that a scientifically trained person who's a doctor has not proven that evil spirits exist.
Oh, wow.
And I said to him, Cliff, that's why I wrote the book. I wrote it for the educated, objective observer. Billy, you've dealt with these things so long. You don't need to read my book to convince yourself. But, I think there are people.
Oh, yeah.
They will not believe faithful ministers. They will not believe faithful priests. Oh, those people are just, got the collection box open. But I don't have any agenda, I just wrote it because I thought I should tell the truth about this stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry for talking so long.
No, it's
No.
interesting.
Is the Bulgarian story the strangest one of these that you've ever encountered? Or that you've ever personally been present for?
I mean, the strangest case was this Satanist woman because, I tell the story, which is you can Google it. It's called The Possession of Julia. Julia was a pseudonym. I don't give any details about her life, but she was a devil worshiper. So my wife and I were in our bedroom and one night, and our cats went berserk. They had never gone so berserk. They were fighting, clawing, I call it like champion prize fighters. I'm looking at my wife, I'm saying, what's going on? Did they eat some bad food or something? We had to separate them, and, we figured, okay, these things happen. Cats are irascible creatures, but, they had been fairly friendly and pleasant with each other. So to my surprise, the next day, I've told this story many times, including in the book. I come to I get a doorbell rings to my home, and this priest, the same priest that introduced me to this field, may he rest in peace. He's with this diminutive woman who's dressed in this odd, dark clothing. And he said, Dr. Gallagher, this is the woman I wanted you to evaluate. I'm saying to myself, I didn't tell you to bring her to my house. And she looks up at me. She'd never met me before. This incident with the cats happened in the privacy of my bedroom. And she said to me, oh, hi, Dr. Gallagher. I've heard a lot about you. And by the way, how did you like those cats last night? Now, two people who I've subsequently found out, two people who had evaluated her before, one psychologist I knew, at this point, the priest wanted a psychiatric opinion. They told me the same thing happened. The cats in their house went berserk. But, she could see things from a distance. She had paranormal powers. She could see things from a distance. She once described another exorcist who was 100 miles away, what he was wearing, where he was. I called the guy on the phone. I knew him. I said, Father, with all due respect, tell me what you're doing. He said, who wants to know? I said, I want to know. He said, I'm walking along the beach, which is unusual for me, and I'm dressed in my military. He was an ex-Marine. A lot of these exorcists are actually pretty tough guys. And that's exactly what this woman had said he was doing. She knew it somehow. So she had clairvoyance. She levitated. She spoke a lot of languages during the exorcisms, none of which in her case I went to because I'm had a family and a busy profession. But that was the most dramatic taste that I ever saw.
I was going to say that in Investigating the Supernatural, Angels and Demons, he is featured in it, and those stories are told. And the one about the priest where you called him, we did not get that story, but I love that story because It's just that your cases provide a lot of proof. And I think this is really important when we talk about this, having proof, as we talked about, a lot of people saying things without proof today. They really do provide that corroboration. And Julia in particular, those stories are just incredible.
Jenn, when you were, I mean, you had paranormal abilities, clearly. You know, you could provide people with what they at least perceive to be, and you perceived to be at the time, access to their past loved ones. You could provide them with information that you couldn't have imagined yourself, you know, that had to have come from somewhere. I've been wanting to ask all night, what did that do for your ego?
Oh, it's such a great question. The pride without saying you're prideful.
Yeah.
It gives you pride. It gives you a sense of being powerful, but you don't walk around, you know, kind of peacocking. You walk around with this sense of a new identity. People are coming to me for their answers. People are coming to me for help. And that's how the enemy preys on the vulnerable, because if you look at my life alongside of this, I was somebody who battled identity, self-esteem, which actually reminds me of this new movie, the repeat offender Disney is coming out with Hex, where we're introduced to this teenage girl, and it started for me as a teenage girl as well. And the battles of being a teenage girl, and she feels like a misfit, and she's left out, and things aren't going well. And well, here's this thing the enemy is going to offer you, this power, this false sense of identity, of, you know, self-esteem, if you will. And so, yeah, I definitely got an ego, especially when I became, you know, one of the VIP mediums on Long Island. And now I'm having the lunches with the psychic mediums that I used to go to. I was their clients, and now we're, you know, linking arms and consulting with each other on clients and having the lunches, like I said. So, yeah, it definitely made me prideful.
I even think about, you told the story about going to finally letting your friend take you to the church. And I thought about, that's when I started asking questions in my mind about your ego, because I can imagine walking into a place and hearing a pastor talk about things. And this may not have been exactly what happened with you, but I'm in my imagination, it's like, you're like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, I've actually wielded, you know, I've actually interacted with, for you, these are abstractions, or for you, this is academic and intellectual. And yet I've touched this very real thing. And even the fact that probably so many pastors are somewhat skeptical themselves about these sorts of spiritual encounters. And I mean, they're correct about the gospel, but they themselves live in the materialist world that we all occupy, and can be very skeptical, I'm sure, about some of these questions. And then here you are in this moment where you haven't, you're not a believer, you're certainly not a mature believer at the time, and you're thinking, well, I've seen this whole world that you don't even know about, that you haven't even experienced.
Well, see, God in his goodness and grace led me to that specific church, and one of the pastors there was extremely well-versed in divination.
Really?
And he actually started counseling me once I made the decision to attend the church. And of course, I eventually went on to get baptized, but he counseled me. And I actually, that was my first demonic attack after coming to Christ. About a month after I professed my faith in Christ, I'm going to that church. And as you said, I was a baby believer, a month old, and I didn't even know how church worked still. There were 3 pastors, but I only thought the head pastor was the only pastor. And so this one day, the pastor that was counseling me on Tuesdays, he got up to say the sermon, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what he's doing up there. And he starts talking, and I start receiving psychic information about the pastor.
Oh.
This shook me to my core, because now this planted the doubt. Are you really Christian? Are you really saved? Am I doing something wrong? What's going on? And I did not want to go to the Tuesday counseling session, but praise the Lord for the Holy Spirit, who gave me the strength and the nudge to go anyway. And he could see visibly something was wrong with me. I mean, I looked like I'm allowed to make this joke, seen a ghost. But he said to me, "What's going on?" And I told him what happened. He said, "We will not give any credit or glory to the demons, yet you can tell me what happened. You can tell me what was said." And I told him the psychic information that was given to me, and it was very personal. It was deeply personal, something I could never have known about this man, who I had only seen on 3 Tuesdays prior, or 4. And he said, "I'm not going to lie to you, that hit a nerve. Yet we know that the enemy operates in half-truths." So he kind of, filled in the blanks on the rest. And then that was where this battle started for me, with a great pastor who equipped me through the Word of God, of course, through prayer, and prepared me for this walk with the Lord, where there would be attacks. And my salvation is intact, and it was intact. But the enemy got, I don't remember who said it before, but he was definitely angry, definitely angry to lose his grip on me. But I wanted to say earlier, when we were talking about the limits of what demons can do on a person outside of possession. So I talk about this story all the time. When I was a young girl, my sister's friends were using the Ouija board. She was not there. She got the account of it and, of course, shared it with me, a young girl. And these girls were around 13 years old. And they went to the Ouija board, and they asked the Ouija board who would die first. And of course, the demons moved the planchette around and spelled out the name of one of the girls that was there. Now, we didn't know at the time, but this girl, this is why this is so dangerous, especially, was battling depression, self-esteem issues in school, etc. Well, a few weeks later, this girl committed suicide. And so I wouldn't say that the demon killed her by any means, but I would say that the demon, how I say it, is gently nudged her in the wrong direction, planted that manipulation, that idea in her mind to do this thing. And of course, this young lady was outside of Christ. She was not a Christian girl. She didn't have the protection of Jesus. So can the demons, I will say yes, lead you to do things that are,
Well, Jen, they can prompt you.
yeah,
First of
prompt
all,
you. Mhm.
they do not know the future. Only God knows the
Right.
future.
Mhm.
So a lot of times, demons will give messages to people. This is going to happen. This is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And they come to me and say, "Oh my God, this is going to happen." I say, "You have free will. You could still, you can make sure this doesn't happen." But they have specialized knowledge. So they knew she was depressed.
Exactly.
They probably knew she had been thinking about suicide. Did they influence her? Well, yeah. I mean, they can influence people, but they couldn't force her to kill
Right.
herself.
Right.
Yeah.
That came from herself.
Yeah.
I sometimes get calls from prisoners in Alabama, and they'll say to me, "Dr. Gallagher, I'm possessed." First of all, I have no idea whether they're possessed or not, but I killed somebody, and I want you to testify on my behalf that I'm not responsible because I was possessed. And I always say the same thing. I say, first of all, I'm a doctor. I don't like to get involved with the legal system. But second of all, with lawyers in general. But second of all, I don't believe that you're totally blameless. If you killed somebody, it wasn't because demons forced you to kill the person. Okay, well, thank you, doctor.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, we're dealing with this with the Lindsay Clancy case right now and the speculation about that. I'm not saying that it was, a demon possession, but even if it were, wouldn't there be some even if somebody disagreed with what you just said, wouldn't there still be some responsibility on the person for opening themselves up in some way to that possession itself, right? There's a responsibility at some level to it, but to your point, there's a control over the person to a degree that they would not, at least a little bit, be responsible for the murder. The demon would not be responsible for the murder in that case.
Well, this is exactly, people ask me all the time, why when they had a psychic reading, why did a prediction come true? And of course, we know the predictions do not always come true. I mean, I can make
They don't always come true.
correct.
Absolutely.
I can make
Often they're
a
wrong.
prediction, right? I can make a prediction, and I'm a human being, and I can have a high level of accuracy, but I'm not God, so I do not know the future. The same with the demons, who are far more powerful and intelligent than we are. They know many more things than we know. They've been observing for ages. They can make extremely good guesses based on observation, but they can also do what I just explained with that young girl with the Ouija board. They can plant seeds and lead you to self-fulfill counterfeit prophecy.
Right. That's 100% accurate what you're saying. I had a woman who came to me. She was a woman doctor, and she was involved with the occult. She had gone to a fortune teller, and she said, "Dr. Gallagher, I'm coming to you because I came to a fortune teller, and he told me all about my uncle, and we used to spend time in Central Park in Manhattan, and she knew all about me." And I said, "So what's the problem?" She said, "Well, because that was to set her up." She said, "The fortune teller told me recently," this woman was, about 30 years old, single. And she said, "The fortune teller told me I'm never going to get married." And I said, "So what's your reaction?" She said, "I'm devastated." The fortune teller was so accurate about my uncle and my life that I'm sure that he's correct. And I said to her what I just said a few minutes ago. The demons do not know your future. They lie. You do not have to, believe that at all. So she said, "Well, I'll try to act on them." She came back to me a year later to report, and she said, "Dr. Gallagher, I'm engaged to be married. Thank you so much for telling me that, I didn't have to rely on what they said."
Yeah, they can only report what they've seen, what they've seen already take place, the past. They can report that to the psychic. They can report that to the medium. Anything that has already happened up until a second ago, they can report that. But they have to give you that information because that's what gets you on the hook. That's what gives them credibility.
Right.
So then when they're about to spew their future lies, you're going to believe it and get into a very bad place, which will lead you to the overlap of the New Age and the occult, because you are now going to start looking for control and power, going to other things, crystals, cards, etc., astrology, numerology, all of these things. And you're going to
gateway drugs.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a big topic to bring up, but I'll bring it up briefly. The idea of generational curses, which is obviously highly debated, right? But I think pulling back from that, it is interesting because, and you can push back on this if you disagree, but in science, it seems like there's some backing to at least this piece of the puzzle. You have people who say alcoholism runs in my family, suicide runs in my family. To your point, demons are watching everything. They're watching the past, everything that's happened. If your great-grandfather and your grandfather and your father have struggled with something, it would make sense that they would, at the very least, and I'm not even going to use the word generational curse, would put that idea in your head. Or it's like nature versus nurture. You've watched alcoholism, you've watched suicidal ideation. Are you now more prone to it? And is the enemy going to latch onto that because it's a weak point like anything else in your family? And so you'll often hear science talk about this as well in the medical community, that certain things, and maybe there are some genetic elements to things as well, but it seems like you see parallels to that in both spiritually. And
Well, there's also this idea all throughout the scripture of fear not, right? I mean, every time that an angel appears to anyone, basically they say, hey, don't be scared. We're not supposed to live lives of fear. But identity can be a very terrifying thing. And knowing that your father was an alcoholic, knowing that your grandfather was an alcoholic, knowing that your great-grandfather was an alcoholic can certainly cause you to live a life of fear that you too somehow innately are an alcoholic. And I don't claim to know the answer to the question of generational curses either, but I do know that there are a lot of very subtle ways that the enemy ensnares us. And identity is a huge part of so many of them, making you believe that you are what you're not.
or that you will be.
Or that you will be what you're not. So I have two last questions. And the first one is sort of about the moment in which we find ourselves. You look at all of the fallen world that we live in, all the things that are happening in our culture today. And there are some that seem not unique to our moment because, to quote two great men, there's nothing new under the sun. But if not unique to our moment, certainly particular to our moment. Things that are true today that weren't true when we were growing up, that weren't true even 10 years ago. this rampant anti-Semitism that's burning through both the left and the right in this country right now, unlike anything that we've experienced in this country in my lifetime, certainly. This deep division between the sexes, where particularly among the young, people aren't getting married. Young men and young women vote differently. They live differently. They seem to be in competition with each other. They seem to sort of loathe each other in a way that has not been, I think, the common experience of male-female relationships traditionally in this country, certainly in the lifetime of anyone here. You could say, well, there was, third wave feminism and there was the suffrage movement. And yes, I'm not saying there's never been tension between the sexes before, but nothing like what we're seeing right now in living memory. You see what I call true crime Gnosticism among the Wine 30 set, this phenomenon of young women, even Christian women, believing that they have secret knowledge, believing that they see reality when no one else sees reality, and that turns them to, or allows them to be manipulated by online influencers to do actual evil, like falsely accuse people of crimes, disparage innocent people, disparage widows. You see the kind of pornography that's rampant, which we know has obviously is predominantly driven by a technological change that's happened, but is itself a kind of spiritual sickness that results in this sort of these secondary and tertiary effects of, again, exacerbating the problems between the sexes, exacerbating problems in marriages, exacerbating the collapsing birth rate in the country. And we could go on because I think there are some other very particular issues that we're dealing with as a culture right now. Alcoholism on the increase among women at 3 times the rate of men, the SSRI phenomenon, psychedelic phenomenon. So many things are happening within the culture right now. And it leads me to this question, which is, we know the world has fallen, and we know that there are many things that motivate human behavior. And yet there do seem to be these particular sicknesses. I mean, we've never had healthy women healthy girls cutting their breasts off until now. That's a brand new phenomenon. So that one is somewhat unique to our time. It's not, maybe it doesn't say something unique about man, but this phenomenon is unique. And the fact that it has been a kind of social contagion, the fact that there's a 4,000% increase in transgenderism over the last decade and a half, that's a kind of sickness in our society right now that, while it may be of a kind with sicknesses that we've had in society in the past, is particular. So my question is, are there, in addition to temptations and oppressions and possessions, internal oppressions and external oppressions, attacks, all these different sort of categories of spiritual experiences that we've described here today? My question is there such a thing as spiritual sickness? Is there such thing as a spiritual contagion? Is there a kind of spiritual, is there a kind of uniquely spiritual phenomenon that can transmit through a society at a particular time that leads to the kinds of things that we see societies do at various moments, like round up and kill the Jews in the 1930s and 1940s in Germany, or engage in the kinds of horrors that happened in Liberia in the last 20 years ago, where people would engage in cannibalism and the sacrifice of children. These things that seem like madnesses that overtake cultures at these particular moments in time. The Rwandan genocide, where you just take up a machete and kill 500,000 of your neighbors. I understand there are many motivations in the world and that we live in a fallen state, but those sort of temporary madnesses that overtake people, are they fundamentally spiritual? Is there spiritual illness that can be transmitted from one person to another?
Well, I think what you're talking about, Jenn,
if you tell me it's complicated, Dr. Gallagher.
I hate to say it, but it always is. Now, what you're talking about is decadence. Was the Weimar Republic pre-Hitler decadent? Yes. But again, you look at ancient history, in the Bible, the ancient Jews were often fighting against societies that would sacrifice their children. That was decadent. Is it spiritually sick? Of course it's spiritually sick. Are there signs of social pathology in our country? Some of which may be caused by greed and economic struggles of young people, which are real too.
Certainly.
Is it spiritual? I would say yes, you're right. It is a type of spiritual sickness that isn't necessarily totally unprecedented. My favorite definition of history, one effing thing after another. And I'm not minimizing that our culture is going through a very rough time. How much is spiritual? Only God knows.
Yeah.
Jenn, you reacted to that question.
Yeah, I think it is spiritual. I think, but now, just thinking about what you said, it does seem that we've gone through so many periods, even just like the doctor said, where we've seen this cluster of demonic, influence and behavior. However, I have to say that, Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. We don't know when that is. The Bible tells us that people will become lovers of self, that the enemy will do, false signs and wonders. So every day is a day closer to Jesus coming back, but we're on a trajectory. And I don't think things are going to get better. I think things are only going to get worse with the use of the new toys that the enemy has to infect the minds of people. Wow.
Yeah.
So we've referred to Ephesians 6 so many times on the show that I feel like we'd be doing a disservice not to actually read it together. This is verse 10, is I believe what you're referring to. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the economic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. So much of this is about the gospel.
Yeah.
As we close tonight, Billy, would you just tell us the gospel?
And the gospel is that God sent his son for all of us to die for us so that we could live. And he died on a cross and he rose again. And I think a lot of people, they say, well, what does that mean? What does that actually mean for us? What do we do with that? What it means is that we die to ourselves. This goes back to when we talked about Jesus is asked, what are the two most important commandments? Again, and love God and love others. He has a conversation in John 3, and I would encourage anybody who wants to know more about this, read the book of John, but read John 3. Just Google John 3 if you don't know and read it. But he's talking to Nicodemus, and Nicodemus is a religious leader, and he comes to Jesus at night, which is interesting. Like, why at night? Did he not want people to know he was going to him? I don't know. But he starts asking questions, and he says, what do I have to do? And Jesus says, well, you need to be born again. And Nicodemus is like, how could I be born again? How could I enter back into my mother's womb and come out again? That doesn't make sense, right? And Jesus explains what that really means is that you are dying to self. You're living a life for him. And so there may be things that people think, believe, do, ways that we behave that we know don't align with God. There are a lot of people maybe watching right now who they're struggling with things and they think, well, I'm not good enough. I can't go near the Lord. I can't find the Lord. I was just talking to somebody who told me this the other day, actually. And I said, no, that's what Jesus is there for. He's the healer. You go to him and you take those things, you die to yourself and you live for him. And that looks like praying to him, praying to the Lord, reading the Bible, living a Christian life, and turning away from all those things. And so because he came and he died for us, he knows every struggle. Jesus knows every single struggle we face, every temptation we face. He knows that he never fell to them. He experienced all those temptations, but never fell to them. He knows what that means. And he was the perfect sacrifice on the cross for us. So John 3 explains that really well. I hope I explained it decently there, but there's hope in that. And that belt of truth that we just read about, that is what we're to cling to, the truth. And right now, a lot of people have a lot of questions about what is true. We're struggling with that right now. God is the truth. That's what we need to cling to.
Thank you guys very much for spending this evening with me and discussing these really difficult issues. And I would just say that, if you're watching and you're skeptical about the reality of the spiritual, that's just means you're a product of your time. And skepticism isn't the worst thing at all. If you're watching and you're afraid because the things that we discussed sound very fearful or sound very frightening, I would only say, I would point them back to what you just said, and that the answer to these problems and the answer to these fears really isn't found in us either. It's found in trusting in God, who isn't afraid of these things one bit. And I think you brought up praying for the kinds of people in the world who are making these accusations against our friends and doing the kind of evil that I outlined. And whether it's oppression or whether it's depression, possession, or whether it's temptation, or just the basic fallen state of the world, putting our faith in God, trusting in Him with the outcome, and going to Him in prayer for deliverance from all of these challenges is probably the only hope that we've got. And it's a pretty good hope at that. We'll see you guys next time.